Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. It really is another great day to say that. Well, we finally published episode 22 last night, and today we are continuing with episode 23. We are finally catching up and creating some momentum. As I said in the last podcast episode, the good news is that there is still plenty to talk about. Today's episode is in contrast to the handful of key witnesses inside the depository that we just explored in the last few episodes. This current episode 23 begins the focus on the witnesses we are going to talk about who actually saw people in the window or windows of the Texas School Book Depository and that were situated in Dealey Plaza, outside the depository. Over the next couple of episodes, we will explore all these key folks who saw something in the window. I hope you are still taking notes. There is a dizzying amount of detail to keep track of, isn't there? So, this is one more helping, as a Southern friend of mine might say. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 23. There was only one eyewitness in all of Dealey Plaza who immediately stepped forward after the assassination and said that they could positively identify the gunman who had been in the sixth floor window at the time the shots were fired. Oh, there were others who saw men in the windows. We'll get to them in the next episode. But first, we are going to start with the prosecution's star witness, Howard Brennan. At the time of the assassination, Howard Leslie Brennan was a 45-year-old steam fitter. He was a family man with one grandson, and he was then working for Wallace & Beard, which was a local construction company there in Dallas. He had been a steam fitter for almost 20 years, which was a good part of his adult life. He was a union man who worked for the local number 100 in Dallas. That morning, he had stopped to have lunch over at a cafeteria at the corner of Main and Record Streets. Record Street is parallel to and one street east of Houston Street. Brennan finished up his lunch and glanced up at the clock in the restaurant, noticing it was 12:18. He was anxious to see the parade too, like so many others that day, and he had a few minutes still before the motorcade was scheduled to come by. So he casually walked to the corner of Record and Main first, and then from there headed west on Main, finally making the right turn down Houston and walking on the east side of Houston Street. Once he got to the corner of Houston and Elm, he spotted a location that he thought would be a good place to wait for the parade. He crossed the street, finally resting on the southwest corner of Houston and Elm, virtually right in front of the school book depository. Right as he was getting there, the action had already started. There was a man nearby that was having an epileptic fit, perhaps 50 or 60 feet away, east and south of this corner that he was on. Things seemed to be under control with that incident, as there was some members of the public, and it looked like some officers as well, attending to this person. And then eventually, as Brennan recalled, an ambulance came and picked the stricken man up. Brennan would soon look for a better place to view the parade from and walked the short distance over to the retainer wall that is right there in the corner of the plaza where Houston and Elm Street meet. And right there, there's a little park pool. And when Brennan got there, he climbed up on the top ledge of that retaining wall. There he would be for the critical part of this tragic play. Later, authorities would ask Brennan to come back and sit on that retaining wall so that they could take a picture of him right at the spot that he was at in that fateful moment. And not only did they want to know exactly where he was at, but they also wanted to understand his angle of view as he looked up into the sixth floor depository windows. He was wearing gray khaki work clothes that day with a dark gray hard helmet, the typical uniform of a working man of that era. Brennan was curious as he waited for the motorcade to arrive, and his curious eyes began to look up and around, not only at individuals in the crowd, but also at the different building windows, including also some details on some of the buildings, including the fire escape across from the east side of the school book depository, but particularly at the windows of the Texas School Book Depository itself. His first impression was that he had observed quite a few people in different windows at the depository, but in particular, he saw this one man on the 6th floor, a man who had left the window several times, as he recalled it. Several times he left that same window, and he kept coming back to it. It was the extreme right window on the 6th floor. Brennan would testify that he saw no one other than that one person on the 6th floor, no one other than that one person that kept coming back and forth at least 2 more times. He did, however, indicate that he saw multiple people on the next floor down, which is the 5th floor. As he described it, and in his own vernacular of the day, he saw some colored guys on the next floor down. We already know them as the African American gentlemen that were introduced to us in previous episodes. In particular, he only remembers 2 people on the 5th floor. As the parade came by, he watched it from a distance at his perch at Elm in Houston, and as it came onto Houston and then finally turned the corner at Houston and Elm, now beginning the modest decline towards the railroad underpass. And then, suddenly, a loud sound occurred, and at first, Brennan thought it was the backfire of a motorcycle, not unlike many other people who testified the same way about that first shot. Brennan's eyes began to move up as he thought it might also be a firecracker or something like it that was being thrown from a window of the Texas School Book Depository. As Brennan glanced up, he could see that same man in the 6th floor window, and that same man was aiming for his last shot. Brennan looked on as the man in the window was standing up and resting against the left windowsill with the gun shouldered to his right shoulder and holding the gun with his left hand and taking a positive aim. And then he fired. He fired his last shot, and it seemed as if it was a couple of seconds in between those shots. After that last shot rang out, he drew the gun back from the window as though he was taking it back to his side. The shooter paused for another second as though to assure himself that he had hit the mark, and then he disappeared. At the same time, Brennan himself knew the gravity of the circumstance, and he had decided to jump off that little retaining wall and get behind it in order to get some extra protection in case there was a bullet that might come his way. The wall itself is a little higher on the Houston side, and so he tucked himself underneath it. Brennan wasn't an expert on guns, but in his mind it was some type of high-powered rifle. One thing Brennan could not remember was whether there was a scope on the rifle or not. As he sat there staring up, he got a good look at this man because of the 3 times that the man had come back and forth to the window. At one point, this man came to the window and sat sideways on the windowsill itself. That happened before the president's motorcade had arrived in the plaza. Brennan was sure that at one point he could see practically this man's whole body from his hips up. But at the time he was firing the gun, he could only see from his belt up. He did see most of the gun, however, and he thought perhaps 70 to 85% of the gun was visible to him. Brennan estimated that the shooter had pointed the rifle about 30 degrees downward and west by south, so basically down Elm Street toward the railroad underpass, somewhat confirming the idea that he was shooting right at the motorcade. Brennan remembered what this man looked like. He was in his early 30s with a fair complexion, and he was slender, but neat. Well, neatly slender, so to speak, and possibly 5 foot 10 inches tall and probably weighed between 160 and 170 pounds. But Brennan couldn't remember the color of his hair. He did recall this man was wearing light-colored clothes, more of a khaki color. Brennan had problems when it came to recollecting the number of shots. When he was asked about it, that is, how many shots he heard, his answer was positively 2. But then again, he didn't recall a second or middle shot. And as he pondered why, he thought that definitely the first shot sounded like a motorcycle backfire. He was sure of that. And he wasn't sure why his mind characterized the next shot as a firecracker coming from the building. He speculated that perhaps he thought it was a subconscious conclusion with multiple shots involved that they were firecrackers. He really had no idea why only 2 shots stuck in his mind. Moments after the shots were fired, Brennan could see people moving toward the west side of the building and down Elm Street. He could see law enforcement officers scrambling towards the railroad underpass, and he knew that he had to get to someone quick to tell them where the man was that he had just seen with a rifle. So he ran, or maybe walked. He couldn't remember which, but he thought he might have run, because he has a habit of running when something has to be done in a hurry. Well, anyway, there was one officer standing at the corner of the Texas School Book Depository building right there on the street, and this particular officer didn't seem like he was going anywhere in any direction. He was just standing still. Okay, let's stop for a minute. This story is getting to be pretty good. So I'm going to switch to the first-person voice for a moment to do the storytelling. So now you will be hearing from Mr. Brennan himself. I'll try not to use a Texas accent. So I approached him, and I asked him to get me someone in charge, a Secret Service man or an FBI agent, because it appeared to me that they were searching in the wrong direction for the man that did the shooting. That man was definitely inside the building on the 6th floor, but I didn't say the 6th floor at that moment to the policeman. Honestly, I really wasn't sure how many stories the building had at that moment. I did say it was the 2nd floor from the top. That's what I told the policeman, and he answered back. He said to me, "Wait just a minute." I think he had to give some orders or something on the east side of the building on Houston Street. And then, just a few moments later, he directed me over to Mr. Sorrells, who was in an automobile sitting at this point right next to the school depository. Mr. Sorrells was a Secret Service agent. I then described the individual to him that I saw up there in the window. Later that evening, the Secret Service came back over and picked me up. I think it was a Mr. Patterson, I believe, maybe around 6 o'clock that night. I was home by then. Mr. Patterson took me over to the Dallas police station. Oh, and I also mentioned in my discussion with Mr. Sorrells, right there at the time of the shooting, I did mention the 2 colored guys on the floor below where I saw the man with the rifle, and that I had seen both of those 2 running down the steps and running out of the depository. The same 2 colored guys that I saw in the window. I saw them coming, and I immediately recognized them, and I told the officer and Mr. Sorrells that they had been on the 5th floor. The policeman took them into custody almost immediately, I suppose probably to question them and to take their statements. I think it was Mr. Sorrells that actually stopped them. Well, I'm not sure, but I don't think it was an officer of the police department. One thing, I really did positively identify them as the 2 men that were on the floor below the man with the rifle. Well, back to when Mr. Patterson picked me up that evening. He brought me to the station and directed me to go to the 4th floor. In there, I was introduced to several men, including Captain Fritz. Several men were there, but I don't remember their names. Oh, and by the way, I do wear glasses to see fine print, especially when I read my Bible, which I don't read enough, by the way. And I also wear them when I read blueprints. But I do not need them to see far, and I did not have them on that day. I do think the commission should know that the assassination took place in November 1963, but in January 1964, I got both my eyes sandblasted. I had to be treated by a doctor, and I was completely blind for about 6 hours afterward. My eyesight, unfortunately now, is not very good. But anyway, back to the conversation that we had that night at the Dallas police station. Once I got into the office, they told me they were going to conduct a lineup and wanted me to view the people in the lineup, which I then did, but I don't remember any of the people who were in the lineup I think there possibly were 7 or less one, maybe 6. And I did recognize someone in that lineup. I told Mr. Sorrells and Captain Fritz at the time. What I said was that there was one man in the lineup that was looking more like a close resemblance to the man in the window than anyone else in the lineup. Really, I don't remember about any of the other people in the lineup, whether they were white or otherwise, and I have to admit, before I went back that night, I had actually seen a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald on television. I got home that day about 2:45, somewhere around that time frame. Within about 15 minutes or so, I saw his picture twice on television. I saw it twice. That is, the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, before I went down to the police station to see the lineup. And to be truthful, I told them I could not make a positive identification when we were in the lineup room. I want you to know that later on, I did tell the officer something different. Some days later, and I don't remember exactly when, I believe the Secret Service man that identified himself as a Williams from Houston, and I'm not sure of that, and I won't swear to that, that is, whether his name is Williams or not, and he could have been an FBI agent as far as I remember. Yes, it could have been FBI instead of Secret Service. But anyway, I believe he was a Secret Service man from Houston. Well then, he asked me, he said, could you make a positive identification? He also asked me, did you do that for security reasons personally, or couldn't you just do that at all? And then I said to him, with all honesty, but I did it more or less for security reasons regarding my family and myself, because I believed at the time, and I still believe, it was a communist activity, and I felt there had not been more than one eyewitness identified, and if it got to be known, that is, the fact that I was an eyewitness, my family or I might not be safe. It was a great contributing factor. But once I understood that they had the man for the murder of Tippit and that he probably wouldn't be released, that was helpful. And honestly, what happened to change my mind was after Oswald was killed. I was relieved quite a bit that as far as the pressure on myself for somebody not wanting me to identify anybody, well, there was no longer that immediate danger. And one more thing. I can't really tell you whether seeing him on television would have affected my ability one way or the other to identify him. That really is something I do not know as a fact one way or the other. I believe I was about 110 foot away from him at the time, but later on, I believe it runs more like 120 to 126 feet at the angle I was at. Maybe 93 feet based on the reenactment. One thing, I'm pretty sure I was on television that day. I'm pretty sure that those television cameras caught me talking to the Secret Service man right there in front of the building. I think Mr. Lish from the FBI, well, he knows about that footage, and I called him because I know he was looking for it. But I think the part where I was there, it was cut out of that film. And one thing, I never did go inside the depository building, even though I did make my way up onto the steps for a moment as all this was going on. Well, and I do want to say that there were a lot of boxes in the window. Boxes, I remember, were stacked up behind the window. They were zigzagging and kind of stepping down. And the pictures that the FBI took that day of the reenactment, I don't recognize the boxes as being exactly as I saw them on the day of the assassination. At least I don't recall that one box set up that way. Well, whew! We will pause for a minute and ask Mr. Brennan to recess. Maybe get a drink of water. So, as you can tell, Brennan was definitely waffling at times in what you just heard. Certainly had some other contrary things to say throughout his testimony. Things that caused the commission ultimately to downplay him more than they otherwise would have liked to. They needed a star, and he was supposed to be the star. But there were so many holes in his testimony, it might have been Swiss cheese had it been given a food group designation. When he was asked if he had seen the actual discharge of the rifle, the discharge of that last shot, he had to say no. When he was asked whether he saw a recoil or a flash from the gun, he had to say no. He heard the last shot, but he did not see it, actually. These responses seemed somewhat odd for someone who had testified that he was looking straight at the gun during the third and final shot. It really was just an odd communication on his part. As time went on, the Warren Commission critics would point out so many more problems with Brennan's basic testimony. For instance, he testified that the shooter was standing up when he took the shots, when we know now that he was likely sitting or kneeling. Had the shooter been standing, he would have been firing the gun through a double window. And as for identifying him and seeing his face, well, if he had been standing, then his face would have been behind the double glass, and a fairly dirty set of window panes it was, and with a fairly healthy reflection of sun on that moment in the day, looking almost straight upward from the angle he occupied on the retaining wall. He also identified the African American men on the 5th floor, our witnesses from the previous episodes, as having been standing at the time he saw them. They were, in fact, kneeling in some way before a 12-inch high or so windowsill. Maybe he did see their faces, as they all had to be looking out at some point, but it wasn't in the form that he thought, and if they were standing up, it surely wasn't. Take your pick. Later critics would also point out that it couldn't possibly have been Sorrells that he talked to at the Secret Service, since Sorrells was somewhere else right at that moment. Maybe or maybe not on that one. But you get the drift, and I'll just stop there. One good thing Brennan was able to do was to point out and correct yet one more mistake that the FBI had made when taking his original statement. In that statement, the FBI had transcribed that Brennan thought he was some 80 to 90 yards away from the shooter. That's how it was taken down by the FBI agent, when in fact he was probably only 80 or 90 feet away. But what in fact he had told the FBI agent was that the shooter must have been 80 or 90 yards away from the target at the time of the last shot. And that was, in fact, a pretty good estimate. 80 to 90 yards is just about 265 feet, and that is just about exactly how far it was at that point of the headshot, the distance between the shooter and the president. In terms of the reports, this was but another example of sloppy or at least hurried work by the FBI in the middle of all of this. In the same interview with the FBI, which had occurred after he had gone through the lineup process at the police department, he again stated that he could not positively identify Oswald as the person that he saw fire the rifle. Brennan was interviewed again on December 17, 1963 by the FBI, and in that interview, he did finally state that he was sure that Lee Harvey Oswald was the person that he saw in the window at the time of the assassination. And he went on to explain that he felt positive identification at the time of the first lineup was not necessary because Oswald had already been charged with the killing of Officer Tippit. But then Brennan clouded the whole circumstance once again, even more so, by indicating that another factor involved was that he had observed Oswald's picture on television prior to the time of identification, and that also had tended to cloud his identification of Oswald at the police department that night. In the cumulative statements he made in various settings over the entire time frame of his various testimonies, both to the FBI and finally to the Warren Commission, at one point he said this was a factor in identification, and then at another point Brennan said it was not. So, take your pick. It gets even better. The FBI knew there were problems with these various interviews and the fact that he had not made a positive identification at the time of the lineup, and he had various other inconsistencies in his other interviews. So they came back again on January 7th, 1964, speaking to Brennan at his home, and yet, in another classic management of the discussion with the witness, the FBI was able to ask Brandon questions and, quote, confirmed that his viewing of Oswald's pictures on television that afternoon of the 22nd did not help him retain the original impression of a man in the window with a rifle, but it was, in fact, upon seeing Lee Harvey Oswald in the police lineup that he concluded that Oswald most resembled the man he had seen in the window. Classic steering of the witness. and it turned out to be contrary to what was evidently the truth as told by Brennan himself when he finally got in front of the commission. By the time the January 7th interview took place, which was the third in a series of interviews with the FBI, his testimony was simply a patchwork quilt. Take what you want from any one of those individual discussions, put the best pieces together, and finally it would fit the narrative. Well, the Warren Commission was quite aware of all of this flip-flopping back and forth and felt like it required a pre-meeting with Brennan before he testified before the commission. Something that was fairly unusual for the commission's top interrogators to do with a witness, but they did it with Brennan. And they made it a point of discussing on the day of his sworn testimony what went on in that pre-meeting, lest anyone believe that they steered the witness testimony before Brennan got in front of the commission. And so they would specifically work it into the record and testimony that day that no coaching happened in that pre-meeting, or that at least they didn't tell Brennan what to say. One other little small tidbit that came out in Brennan's Warren Commission testimony has an interesting twist to it. When the government booked the tickets for Mr. Brennan to come to Washington to testify, well, they also booked tickets for the three men that were in the window that day on the 5th floor, or at least arranged for the three men from the 5th floor to be on the same flight. We know them all well by now from previous episodes. And like I said, those men just happened to be booked along with Mr. Brennan on the same flight to Washington. Perhaps so that Mr. Brennan could see them and spend several hours with them. Perhaps. That happened very conveniently before he would then be scheduled to give testimony as to whether or not he could identify those men in a series of photos of them in the windows. Photos that he would be shown during his interrogation by Mr. Bellin. I don't think they intended for him to volunteer that little tidbit in the middle of his sworn testimony. That is, that he rode up on the same plane with those gentlemen. And Bellin certainly didn't try to explore that. Well, of course not. That was a dog that needed to stay still on the floor. Again, like most things that were messy for the narrative, the commission's lawyers motored right past this fact as quickly as they could. And so it must have been just a coincidence that Brennan had been having trouble identifying those three men from the 5th floor in some of the pictures. In earlier discussions, that is, making an identification mistake at one point related to these three men in the various photographs. And getting them right was important, as he had been so sure about two of those men from the very get-go. And I guess, of course, it could be inferred that if he wasn't able now, anyway, to identify the men on the 5th floor, identifications that he had previously been so sure of, well then, that might then create at least a slight credibility problem around his ability to positively identify the one ever more important identification of the man on the 6th floor. So maybe it was just a tiny way to make sure that Brennan's testimony about all these identification matters, and ultimately the identification of Oswald as the shooter on the 6th floor, went well. I'm just saying. Well, you know there's a lot of coincidences percolating in this case, and a lot of things that went on that day in Dallas. Maybe as far as the authorities deliberately putting them on the plane together, maybe it was just the simplest of innocent explanations. So simple that in those days there was probably only one airplane flight on that day out of Dallas going to Washington, and everybody just had to be on the same flight. And that probably is the God's honest truth about it, or some other innocent reason. Oh well. Let's just let that dog lay still on the floor as we motor by. We've got bigger fish to fry up anyway, and the trail is getting cold. All right, back to Brennan. Before he completed his testimony, he gave one more reason why, in the initial discussions at the initial lineup that night, and then again in his second FBI interview in December, one more reason that he declined in both circumstances to positively identify Oswald as the man he saw on the 6th floor. Well, it seems that Oswald's television appearance did have an impact on Brennan's thinking. Only, ironically, Brennan admitted that it actually served to raise doubts and not to reinforce what he had seen. When he saw him on television that day, to Brennan, the man looked much younger on television than he did from Brennan's recollection of him in the window. The picture of him that he had in his mind was that the man in the window was older, a few years older, say 5 years older, than the man he had seen on television. Brennan also offered up another interesting fact that probably genuinely reflected how frightened he might actually have been and worried about the safety of his family and himself. Clearly a legitimate concern, I think. To the commission, he had disclosed that he had discussed things with his wife and that he had contemplated moving his wife and his grandson, who happened to be living with them at the time, and also his daughter, basically moving them out of town somewhere in secrecy. But he said that eventually, by talking to the Secret Service and giving his statement to the Secret Service, that they were able to convince him that it would be strictly confidential. But even at that, he still felt like being the only eyewitness there would still be a chance that anything could happen to his family. His wife finally cautioned him that a person just can't get away, wherever they might go. It wouldn't assure them that they were getting away from the trouble. Curiously, we all wonder who told him that he was the only eyewitness, or did he just assume so? There were hundreds of people who may have had the opportunity to look up and see the shooter that day. He is the only one who apparently both saw it and came forward to make the identification. And somehow he knew that he was the only one. Fishy at best, don't you think? Well, it seemed like every time Brennan elaborated on some detail, it was a detail that detracted from the idea that the person he saw or identified in the lineup really was Lee Harvey Oswald. A good example of that was when he went on to indicate that the person in the lineup was not in the same clothes as the person in the window, and probably both the person's shirt and trousers were different, and that he just didn't have the same clothes on. Well, we know that Oswald was spotted in different clothing by different people seemingly within seconds or minutes. And in some ways, all the clothing issues and inconsistencies of that clothing are a part of the body double question that always comes up, or at least a Houdini routine that he was engaging in some way. He would have had to have been a quick change artist to be in all the outfits everyone identified him in that short time frame. But we will get to that one later. Well, as you have just experienced, there were a lot of problems with Brennan's testimony that day, and I suspect that David Bellin, the commission attorney, knew it. Maybe not right then, maybe not all of the problems, but at least some of them. He knew long before he took his testimony at the actual commission hearing that his star witness was beginning to say things that were not so credible, especially if you knew the layout of that window as we just described it. And I think he began to have some concerns about what this man might say that was off the narrative, so to speak. One point for me in the review of the Warren Commission testimony is the moment toward the end of questioning of each witness where the interviewer, in this case David Bellin, asked a final open-ended question saying something to the effect, "Is there anything else important about this case that you would like to tell us today?" When that moment inevitably comes near the end of Mr. Brennan's testimony, an odd pivot was abruptly inserted in the conversation by David Bellin. It was to become a trademark technique that is buried right there in plain sight, time and time again in the sworn and written witness interrogations contained in the volumes of the Warren Commission report. So Bellin asks that final catch-all question, "Do you know anything else of importance that we should know about?" And then Brennan begins to answer the question, and the little bit he got to say before he was cut off was interesting. He said, "Well, not of any importance. I don't remember anything else except." And then, right at that moment, Mr. Bellin interrupted him and said, "Let me ask you this," completely cutting him off and redirecting his testimony. Brennan never got to answer the question. It was like a hanging chad. We will never know. We will never know what came after the accept. Look, we have all met intense people. I would consider myself one of those intense people. And sometimes intense people get ahead of themselves. Rather innocently, an interrogator can especially do that. His mind already on to the next question, even before he hears the answer to the question at hand. If this had happened only a handful of times in the testimony, I would chalk it up to that. But it happened too many times and with too many critical witnesses and at just the most convenient of moments to protect the narrative. Too many times that way. Too many times for it to be totally innocent. It was nothing more than a classic interruption technique. Bellin had already gotten what he wanted, and he didn't want anything more. The Warren Commission lawyers managed the interrogation process to get what they wanted for the narrative. That doesn't mean they told people what to say. Obviously, they did not do that. At least I hope not. They did what skillful lawyers do all day long, what they are taught as a matter of their profession to do: emphasize the facts that support their case and de-emphasize or avoid the facts that don't. Sadly, while they, meaning all of those commission lawyers and the commissioners themselves, publicly trumpeted that the truth was their client, there are too many facts in this case where it's clear that they or someone on their behalf helped them make up their minds about what happened, or what they were going to say about what happened. As we now know from the very outset, and then from there on out, it was about testimony and witnesses that supported the narrative. We should all be thinking about this when it comes to seeking justice and finding the truth in any circumstance we find ourselves. Look, it's a basic tenet of human nature. That is what people do. They rationalize and then they advocate their own position. In this case, it was no conspiracy related to a coup d'etat. It was simply part of a simple cover-up to tell the story the way the authorities believed it best to be told. Sinister in a way, yes, but sinister in a way that is quite different from the general conspiracy narrative. Could the two be linked? Yes, it's quite possible, but let's not go there yet. This is a simple misdemeanor of sorts, to use an almost surreal analogy. This is a simple misdemeanor, and in the world of interrogations, well, there are greater felonies to be committed by the authorities. But you will have to listen to the next few episodes when we listen to the last few key witnesses who saw folks in the windows, and then finally turn to the idea that there might have been shots fired from the grassy knoll. So, stay tuned. And what is coming next? It's going to get really interesting, and certainly the prelude to something potentially more sinister than just poor old Lee Harvey Oswald. Thank you for listening to episode 23 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.